Okay, so good morning, everyone. I think we can start. If someone appears later, it's his fault. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of Spring 1. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about application security pitfalls. So that means I will basically destroy everything you learned the last 2.5 days. So that talk is not about Spring security, first of all. So hopefully you already attended the talk about Spring security from Rob yesterday. Was it? Yeah, probably. That is all besides Spring security. All the stuff Spring security cannot handle. And that's not because Spring security is a bad framework. It's because some of the stuff just cannot be handled by Spring security automatically. So first of all, some words about me. So my name is Mike Wiesner. I'm working for Pivotal or Spring Source or whatever. I'm right now a technical instructor at Pivotal, so I usually deliver trainings around Spring, Groovy Grails, and so on. But I used to be a Java developer, a consultant, all that kind of stuff for more than 10 years now in Java Enterprise. And my focus is clearly on application security and enterprise integration, which goes hand in hand usually, right? I also sometimes contribute to Spring security, not so much in the last year. I'm also the creator of the Spring Security Kerberos extension, which is not finished yet, but hopefully soon, fingers crossed. And as you probably know, application security is of course an important topic. That's why we have that on that conference. And that's why we have a dedicated session just about application security. And the idea of that session is to give you some ideas what application security is all about. So that it's not just authentication authorization. I'm pretty sure that you know that authentication authorization is one part of application security. I would say it's the easiest part of application security. And the reason for that is probably because we have that great Spring Security framework which will help you with all of that stuff. But application security is much more than just authentication authorization. And that is what I wanted to tell you in the next 90 minutes. So we'll just give you a brief overview of it. I'm not able to teach you everything about application security in 90 minutes. That's just not possible. But after that session, you probably will start changing a lot of your stuff in your application, hopefully. Or hopefully not, because then everything is secure already in your application. Probably you shouldn't tell me your URL of your application. So you don't want me as an enemy usually. So again, I'm a developer as you, so I'm not a security guy. I'm not one of these guys who try to hack everything, right? Well, I do it in my free time, but so I'm really a developer. So my passion is not about just telling you how can you secure your application. It's also about how your application still keeps maintainable, because that's a pretty big challenge usually. So securing an application is very, very easy. Any idea how you can really make an application really secure 100%? Plug it out, yeah. Plug out the network cable. Secure, right? By the way, if you get one of these great answers or questions, you get a USB thumb drive collected after it. It's one of these great Pivotal thumb drives. So you got one. So yeah, it's very easy to make an application secure, but then it's not really working anymore, right? So we need to find some sweet spot between it where an application is somehow secure. It will never be 100% secure, but yeah, that's okay, hopefully. But we should be as secure as possible, but still keep it maintainable, because if it is 100% secure but not maintainable, then what's the deal? So you cannot use your applications then, right? If you don't have any features in it, but it is secure, what's the deal with that application then? So application security is a very broad topic, and as you know, in Enterprise Java, the only framework is, of course, Spring, the only interesting one. So therefore, Enterprise Java equals Spring, and Spring and security is, of course, so if you apply Spring security to Spring, then, of course, that is Spring security, right? That's why it's called Spring security, right? So that means if you want to secure an enterprise application, which is implemented in Spring, what else? Then you have to use Spring security. And then you're done. That is what a lot of people think. You not, because you are in that session. So every time I say that all the people think this, then you're always excluded. You are the good guys, right? So that is what a lot of people think. Apply Spring security, I'm safe forever. And if not, I will blame the Spring security guys for it. Good idea, first of all. But at the end, you will have the problem and not the Spring Security guys, because it's open source, so you cannot blame us, at least not legally. That's a good thing about open source. We can do whatever we like, because no one legally can blame us. So what is application security again? So who already knows what OWASP is? Ever heard about OWASP? Oh, very good, so half of the room probably. The other one maybe still sleeping. So it's Open Web Application Security Project. It stands for Open Web Application Security Project. And the idea of that OWASP stuff is that they collect stuff about web application security. So not only web application security, most of the stuff is also related to application security in general. And they usually create that top 10 list of the standard attacks or the standard problems of web applications. So that list changes every year a little bit. And most of that list gladly is covered by Spring Security, so thanks to Rob, sorry. He's on the back, by the way, if you want to blame him. So for example, broken authentication / management. So if that is not working and you configured everything right in your Spring Security configuration, then you can really blame Spring Security for that, because that is the idea of Spring Security. The same for insecure cryptographic storage. Of course, you must make that right. So you have to hash your password, for example. If you store your password in clear text in your database without hashing it first, it's your fault. But if you hash it and then it's still not secure, it's a problem of Spring Security. So Spring Security can handle that for you, which doesn't mean that it will do that automatically. It just means it can handle it for you. The same for the so-called failure to restrict URL access, where you secure a URL and you say everyone who wants to access that URL needs to be an admin or user, whatever. And then Spring Security can help you with that, right? And Spring Security can also somehow help you that it ensures that you always use an SSL transport. So especially in 3.2, there's even a new feature for that available. So it can make sure that you always have a secure transport, which is good for the user, of course. And then in Spring Security 3.2, a lot of stuff even has been added. One which is really great, because that was very challenging to do that yourself, is the so-called cross-site request forgery attack. So who knows what the cross-site request forgery attack is? Okay, so not everyone was at Rob's talk. Hopefully I have time to explain that later on, because I don't concentrate on that, because it's handled by Spring Security. So you could check out the blog. So if don't have time handling it in that session, check out the blog of Rob Winch, because in that blog he talks about that cross-site request forgery and how Spring Security can help you with that. It's a pretty nasty one. And the other one is cross-site scripting. So who knows cross-site scripting? Much more, great. So cross-site scripting is basically, because I have to explain that a little bit, because Spring Security will not handle it 100% for you. It will just help you doing that. Cross-site scripting means that a user submits some input. So you can write a command, for example. You can write a command to a blog. So you read a blog and you write a command on it. And then instead of just saying, yeah, I find that entry great and I like Spring Security and so on, you could just post a JavaScript code, a scriptlet, right, in that comment field. And then you post it, and then probably the website will render that later on, because it's a comment, right? And if you post a JavaScript scriptlet, that scriptlet will be executed, right? So if you don't mask it or encode it or somehow, then it will probably just be rendered. So therefore, everyone who basically displays that blog entry now will also execute your scriptlet. And then you can imagine that you can submit pretty nasty JavaScript stuff there, and everyone will execute that, right? And if it's something like application where you are logged in already, then it will be executed with your permissions even. So that's a pretty nice one. It's usually pretty easy to solve that cross-site scripting stuff, because you just must make sure that every user input is first of all validated. We will come back to that in a minute. And second, that you encode it all the time. So you should never render something directly on a JSP or whatever. Always use, for example, the s-oauth tag. So who knows the s-oauth tag? Okay, anyone else? Hopefully it's not using JSP. If you use JSP, never use that $ and then just print out stuff, especially not which was entered by a user. Always use the cout tag for that, or use time leave. Okay, so it's usually very easy to solve that cross-site scripting yourself, but also Spring Security might help you with that, because Spring Security can tell the browser that the browser should somehow detect if that is a cross-site scripting problem and then solve it more or less magically. So that's why I say it's part of Spring Security 3.2, but you still have to do something yourself in order to make it really secure. So that is not the interesting stuff, because that is the stuff Spring Security can handle for you. But what about all that other stuff? Sorry. So like injection, insecure direct object references, and so on. Well, the bad news about that is you have to handle that. And probably no frameworks. So there are frameworks out there who claim that they handle all the OWASP top 10 stuff, which is only somehow true, because they might help you with that, like the cross-site scripting support from Spring Security, for example, but they cannot solve that completely. So for example, security misconfiguration, it's one of the top 10 stuff. A framework cannot help you if you don't configure it properly, right? So maybe a penetration test can help you with that, but not a framework. So security misconfiguration is clearly something you have to do yourself. And that's why I call security a process and not a task. So you can never complete security. So if you have a project plan or a task or story card which says apply application security to the project, and then you say it's completed, that's it, that's not really possible. So application security is something you always have to do all the time during the development. Everyone in the development team needs to think about application security. And if you don't believe me right now, you will see it after the session, that really everyone is able to do that. By the way, I will not display slides now for 90 minutes, so don't be afraid. I will switch over to code pretty soon, and I will do kind of live hacking. And that's not just live coding, it's really live hacking. Hopefully you enjoy that. So let's go to the first one. And that's so basic, I just skip it as live hacking, just display it on the slide. So who knows what SQL injection is? Oh, very good. But who is a Java developer, by the way? Just to make sure that everyone can raise their hand. Okay, good. So SQL injection, it's there since years. Still a problem. What is it? So we submit a form to BBI. What is BBI? It's a big bad internet. And it's a cloud, right? Everything is a cloud nowadays. So we submit a form, and it finally goes to our big web server. And then it goes to the database, and we execute that as a SQL statement. So even if you use Hibernate or that stuff, finally it will become a SQL statement. But what happens if we submit something like that? So we don't know the password. Instead, we submit something like this one, where we say, well, I don't have the password. I say, or 1 is 1. What happens now is that I change the SQL statement on the server, and I change it to user where user equals user and password equals whatever. It doesn't matter what you write there, because you say or 1 is 1. 1 is 1 is typically always true, depending on the database, which means you don't need to know the password, and you're always logged in, right? So how can you solve that? Any ideas? Yeah? What was that? Okay. So using the JDBC prepared statement, does that solve that? Using the JDBC prepared statement? Yeah, 100%? With every database? Yeah? Well, what you have to know about the JDBC prepared statement is, it is a JDBC prepared statement. It's not a prepared statement, a database prepared statement. It's a pretty big difference. So if you would have a database prepared statement, it will solve it. And if not, then blame the database. If it's a JDBC prepared statement, then if you check out the specification, it says a JDBC prepared statement might be translated into a database prepared statement if the database supports it. If the database doesn't support it, it will just expand the question mark.
Which database doesn't support it?
I don't tell you. Unless you sign an NDA. No, most of the databases do support it, and if you use a JDBC prepared statement, especially if you use something like Hibernate or JPA, then Hibernate itself will even support it. So the SQL injection is usually solved as long as you use a real database stuff. Right? So as long as you use pivotal stuff. But the thing is, you should always question it. So just don't take it for granted. And so especially if you search on Stack Overflow, for example, you get an answer on Stack Overflow which says, well, SQL injection is solved using a prepared statement. Don't trust that. Stack Overflow is not a source you can trust. Right? So there are a lot of information on Stack Overflow who are just not right. And I will tell you at least one of them later on. And that is a big problem if you trust Stack Overflow, because these are just users, right? These are just developers, and you might get a good answer. And even if people say, yeah, that's a good answer, it doesn't mean that it's the right answer, okay? So don't trust the BBI, the big bad internet. Stack Overflow is one part of that BBI. And don't trust Wikipedia. So only trust me. So SQL injection, yeah, that's a nice one. Everyone knows that. Hopefully every application is secure. So every application can handle that SQL injection somehow, and handle means that it's not working. But there are more interesting attacks nowadays available, because nowadays we not only have these web server database stuff, we also have more modern frameworks, and one of them is Spring integration, for example. Great framework, by the way. Who knows Spring integration? Oh well, not so many. Half of the room probably. Well, it's actually too late to attend a Spring integration talk. So what is Spring integration? Though you can basically set up a workflow with Spring integration and handle stuff. And in my example, I set up a workflow which can handle XML input. So we get a list of orders, and that list of orders contains orders, obviously. And it also can specify the type of the order. So we have a web shop and we wanted to sell VMware Fusion. So of course nowadays we wanted to say Pivotal HD instead of VMware Fusion. And we specify the type, because type can be download or boxed. So you can download VMware Fusion or you can get a boxed version of it, right? And it will be shipped. So we have these different inputs which specify the type and the item and the price and all that kind of stuff. And now we set up a workflow on the web server which handles that input. And as we are living in 2013, that is not just a Java method. It is, of course, set up using Spring integration. And what is Spring integration? You don't need to read everything there, doesn't matter. The idea of Spring integration is that we have the so-called channels and pipes, a filters and pipes architecture, where we basically get an input to a channel. So here we get an input to that from file channel. And then we have some transformer, first of all. So we parse the XML, then we go to the next channel, and then we finally go to a so-called router. And that router basically looks at the type, and depending on the type, it starts a different workflow. So if it's a download or a boxed version. So that means it will inspect the type attribute, and based on that, it will either go to the download channel or the box channel, because the workflow is pretty different on our server, right? So download means we need to prepare a download link, we need to send it out to the user, and that's it. Box means we really have to ship something, so we need some more information, maybe even, all that kind of stuff. And in order to make that more maintainable is the key here, really, we decided to do that with Spring integration and not just implement it, which is obviously a good idea to do that. And also, by the way, of course, we check if the order is authorized. So that means if the one who submits the order has authenticated, and if he has a role which allows him basically to do that order. So therefore, we can also put in security here. So we don't need Spring Security anymore, because we can put it in, well, at the back we use still Spring Security, but we can put in a filter here, and that filter will do the authentication for us. And he will do the authorization, yeah, all that kind of stuff. Good stuff. Okay, so that's our architecture. We get a file, we transform it into an object, we route it depending on the type, and we finally ship it. That's it. So what has that to do with injection? So I will come back now to injection again. By the way, are you still awake, everyone? Okay, looks good. So let's do a demo to make sure that you remain awake. Okay. Oh, looks not too bad. So that is actually the stuff I showed you on the slides. So that is the, my short demo project. By the way, it's on GitHub. You can download that later on and play a little bit with it. I left out the interesting parts. So let's first of all check out the order processing. So that is the Spring integration configuration. Okay, it's a little bit too big. Here we go. So that is basically what you have seen on my slide. So we don't do the router stuff here because it's dynamic, but here you need to have a connection between that router and these two channels. So that has nothing to do with security. First of all, it's just standard Spring integration. And you see that we have all these channels. So we have the channel from file, we have a channel new order XML, and between that we have a transformer, which transforms a file into an XML or a message. And we have a router. And now it becomes interesting. Because we have XML, we decided to have a so-called XPath router, which is a pretty interesting component of Spring integration. Because I implemented all of that stuff now just using that Spring integration stuff, so I haven't coded a lot of Java for that. All that workflow is basically implemented using that Spring integration DSL here. And the only thing I need to do is that I specify an XPath expression which says, look at the order object, the order XML element, and check out the type attribute. And based on that type attribute, we do the routing. So that means if I open one of these XML documents here, so that's a test input, then you see that this one has an order type box. So that means our XPath router will first of all search for the order element, and then it will extract the type attribute. And the value of that type attribute, that is the one which decides which channel should be the next one. So that means, as you can see, I don't specify that channel box or channel download should be the next one. It's basically dynamic. And then we have these two channels, download and box. And based on the attribute, it will go to download or box. By the way, you can always ask questions, right? So it's sometimes hard to interrupt me, but... What would
happen if the type was something other than that, a mistake?
Yeah. That's it. That's the interesting part now. Because I've seen that in a lot of projects that people do that because that XPath router is really great. It's not so great if it is user input. Because if the user is in charge of that attribute value, he can do pretty interesting stuff. So first of all, let's start that application. So we have three inputs here. One is input box, one is input download, and all of them have a valid authentication in it. The user is always Mike, who else should it be? And the password is always the type, so the password is download or box. And when we have an invalid one with either Mike and an invalid password, that shouldn't go through because it's invalid, right? So if I start the application now, so I have a short bootstrap class here. Then you see that basically two of these files passed through. The first one, Mike box, and the other one, Mike download. And the third one didn't pass through because the security filter filtered that out, right? Because it was Mike invalid. That's what we wanted to have, exactly. And imagine now that the last one, we don't know the real password because we are a hacker. So therefore, we cannot use the real password, but what we could use is we can change the type of the channel to download secured. And then we basically skip the security filter because that XPath router just uses everything he gets as the next channel. And if I have some knowledge about the application, then I might guess that the next channel might be download secured. So that means I skip that authentication stuff. So here we have that XPath filter which says, check out if the user is Mike and the password is box or download. And I can just skip that over and say, well, I don't want to have that authentication, obviously. So just go directly to download secured or box secured. Great, right? So let's prove if that works. Here we go. So here's our new order with an invalid password without any authentication. And that's also one type of the injection, right? Not SQL injection, it's Spring integration injection, XML injection. It's not the fault of Spring integration, it's you set it up wrong, right? You didn't validate it before. So that's really all about validation here. So you should have validated it before, and you should specify what types are allowed. But he didn't do that. So you, of course, will do that, of course, but the other developer didn't do that. Yeah, one of these problems, right? Any questions to that? Yeah? So the more interesting demos come at the end. So that is also a code injection or an XML injection here. And how do we solve that stuff? Well, it's really all about input validation. That's really one of the golden rules in application security. Validate every input you get. It doesn't matter if you get the input from the internet or from your local network. The local network is even more worse. So some people believe that if you have a public web service, then it's probably the most risky thing because anyone can hack it, right? It's public. And if you have a web service only accessible inside of your company, for example, then people might think, well, it's not so important that it is secure because it only runs inside of my company network. No one else can access that one. In fact, that is the one which is even more important. Anyone knows why these internal stuff is more important than the external one? More important to secure?
No, the internal one will be accessed by people who knows how the system works.
The internal one, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. So if you have an external public web service, then probably the people don't know what is behind that web service. Whereas with an internal one, people might easily get that information, even in a big company. And also the difference is, with a public web service, the information is usually not as important as the internal one. So if you have an internal application, then you have all that interesting data in it usually, all the financial data of your company, depending on the web service, of course. With a public web service, usually you don't have, or you shouldn't have all that information in it. So therefore, input validation is always important, not only for external stuff. And every time you get user input, and it really doesn't matter what type of input it is, if it is XML, JSON, form input, whatever, you always have to validate it. And the great thing is that Spring offers you that bean validation since years now to validate your input, which helps you validating Java input, right? And finally, most of the time anything will be Java at the end. But that will not help us with the problem we have seen before because the problem already appeared before we actually transformed it into Java, which makes sense to do the routing based on XML, and then if everything is routed, we will basically transform it to Java. So we need to handle it differently. So that means if you do XML routing, no, that was too early, then you also have to do an XML validation, first of all, which is somewhat challenging because usually in our classes we teach don't do XML validation, and now I say do XML validation. And you should have some sweet spot between it because you should not validate the whole XML document because that can lead to another application security problem. And it also is that you will end up with a tight coupled web service and you probably don't want to have that. So we should somehow validate it. But before we actually see how we validate it, the more important one is where you validate it. So imagine you have a web application, then nowadays everything is JavaScript, of course, and based on WebSockets and Stomp and all that great stuff. And therefore, some people try to validate it now instead of on the server. They try to validate it in the client. And of course, the server is nowadays not one of these big boxes. It's basically, of course, a virtual machine running in a cloud and all that kind of great stuff. So that means someone is accessing that application, and not only computers are accessing our application nowadays, all these mobile devices and all that kind of stuff is accessing our applications. And of course, we could do some validation in one of these parts, which is great for the user. It's not so great for the application security. So that means if you validate the input with JavaScript, for example, or inside of your app, which is deployed to an iOS device or whatever, then that's great for the user because it saves the round trip to the server. But finally, you should only validate it on your application. So don't validate it or exclusively validate it on the machine or even not on a phone. You always have to validate it basically on your server. That's the only one which is important, or the only one which solves all these problems. That's important. That's about trust zones. So don't trust your users. Only trust your application. Don't trust your runtime as well, as long as it is not from Pivotal. So only trust your application. Do everything in your application. Make sure that it works. Test it. Verify it. Right? So and also do these. Not only do the positive test where everything is great. Also test if your validation is working and will skip the message, for example. And that is called the trust zones. And that is an important one. So it's not just enough to validate it. Also the location where you validate is important. So let's fix now our application. It's pretty easy to do that. So I prepared something because you don't want to see me coding here. And what I did is basically I added something to our Spring integration workflow. Oops. Just too big. Let me just check out the source. Okay, didn't add it here. That's the wrong one. No. Okay, so for some reason it's not in that file, but I will submit it to GitHub later on. You have to trust me now. No, it's not in there. Here it is. We now have a filter. So an XPath filter, that's an additional component. And it says, listen to everything which arrives in new order XML and go to the output channel. And the output channel is new typed order XML. So we have a new channel which says the name new typed order XML. And now we have an XPath expression as well, which says the only type which is allowed is box and download. If you submit something like download secured, it's not an allowed type. And that's a very sweet spot between, because we do some kind of validation, but we don't validate the whole message. We just validate the security interesting part, and that is what type is it. And we filter it to the types who are allowed. And you still have a loose coupled web service, so you still have tolerance and all that kind of stuff, but you also can make sure that no one can inject code into your workflow and skip parts of your workflow. Right? So that means if I change it now and go to my Bootstrap class and use the other XML file. So it should be called secured. Then we have again our two elements, mic box and mic download. We don't have the mic invalid anymore. So that was an easy way, right? It's just one more filter and that's it. And again, don't validate the whole message. It's not needed to validate the whole message for that. The only interesting part is the attribute in that case. Okay? Great. So that is input validation, or one part how input validation can help us solving these injection stuff. So injection is basically always that you have missed input validation. That should never happen. So really validate everything which arrives at your server. And that is also how we can solve cross-site scripting and all that kind of stuff. So with that one, we can solve already a lot of things. So validation helps us with a lot of these top 10 stuff. It helps us with injection, I would say 100%, because injection always is that something arrived at the server which was not really meant to be on the server, and validation will help us with that. Insecure direct object reference is also something where validation can help. So if someone tries to access an object directly, then validation can help you with that. And also Spring Security can help you somehow with that, with the pre and post authorized filters. And also with unvalidated redirects and forwards, it even says unvalidated, right? So validation is important, okay? But it's also important how you do it. Don't do it too strictly, because then your code will stop working. Use something between it, so like an XPath expression, bean validation, all that kind of things. Any questions until now? Hopefully at the end, I will go to the more interesting part later on, though it's basically, the idea is basically that you submit something to a server which will, or someone submit something to the server, and that will lead to a redirect to where you usually don't want to redirect people to a hacked version of it and all that kind of things. But if you have time, I will come back to that, but we have more interesting stuff to come. It's also very good explained if you just go to that one, to the OWASP top 10, and then search for that unvalidated redirects and forwards. It explains it very good. Okay, so that's about input validation, but yeah, probably you have heard about that. Maybe you haven't seen an example with Spring integration, and that hopefully makes you think about your Spring integration or Spring Batch configuration as well. But let's come to a different point, and that is how application security might affect your web application itself. And here's a typical architecture from a web application. It needs to be the one you use, but it might be similar. So we have a Spring MVC service, a Spring MVC controller, sorry. We have services, we have repositories, obviously implemented with Spring Data, and a database. And now, back in the old days of Spring, you would configure all that stuff with XML, right? Because XML rules the world. Yay. And of course, you have to configure your Servlet container with XML as well. And as you probably have seen during that conference, we don't want to use XML anymore in most of the projects. It's our opinion. You can have a different one. It's still our opinion that we don't want to use it. Well, it's mine. It's not for all the other ones. So I don't want to see all that XML stuff. What is the replacement for it? Java config. So who knows about Java config already? Well, not too many. So the idea is basically replacing all that XML stuff with a Java configuration. And Spring supports that already in Spring 3.0. But also the Servlet container supports that. And that is something not a lot of people know. So starting from Servlet 3.0, like Tomcat 7, for example, the Servlet container supports a replacement for a web.xml file. And that helps us, for example, bootstrapping a Spring application in that of a web container without providing a web.xml file or changing a web.xml file, which is great for all the people who don't like XML. It's also the way, for example, how Spring Boot works and all that kind of things. So it's a dynamic configuration of your Servlet container, which is great because it will, it's not XML, which is always great. And it also helps us do more dynamic stuff because we are not only limited to one XML file, we can have several of these container configurations. And we just deploy them and they get activated. That's basically the idea. So how does that stuff work? So it's the same application, but a different part of it. Let me see. So here's the starting point, the web container config. And Spring provides you with a class which is called the abstract annotation. Come on, where's the scroll bar? The abstract annotation config dispatcher servlet initializer. Easy to remember, right? Okay, the abstract annotation config web initializer. That one is basically one of these subclasses of a subclass and so on. And the idea of that one is that the only thing in order to start up a Spring application in a Servlet 3.0 container is you have to implement 3 methods. One which points to your root application context. We don't have that in that demo, so we skip it. One is the Servlet application context. We have it, so we point to a Spring configuration file here, or the Spring configuration class. And, so of course, the mapping. So in that case, we wanted to map our Spring MVC application to /REST. You guess what it will be? It will be a REST web service at the end. And that is all we need to do. That's a replacement for the web XML, for the context loader, initializer stuff, and all that kind of things. More than one of these classes. You can have more of these classes. So you can have as many web container configs, and they will all be merged together. And that is just a convenient. It helps you starting that up. So if you want to have more control over it, then you can always write all that stuff yourself. So if you look at the base class, it will just create an application context and all that kind of thing. So therefore, that is just for your convenience, and that's for the standard ways to do that. If it's a more interesting way or a more advanced way, then don't use that class. Instead, just do it yourself. It's not very hard. But But the point here is we point to a Spring Java config file, and that, as you can see, is very small. It just says enable WebMVC, it sets up a component scan. We'll actually have an XML file here, but just because I did that last night and then hadn't had enough time to do that in the Java config, that marshalling thing. It's a very new thing. So you can also point to an XML file. That is what I wanted to show you here. That's it, basically. So, and then we have our REST controller. And that REST controller has a method where we can get orders. So we map it to order and some ID, and then we retrieve an order. So in my example, I don't have any database or anything else. Just to keep it simple, we just have an object in that controller, and that is our order object. We initialize it with some test data, and that is what is returned, and that's it. Just to keep it simple, because I don't want to tell you how to implement that stuff. I want to tell you how to break it. So let's start up the web application. Yay. And do a GET request. And as you can see, we get back some XML, order, customer mic, name ABC. That's it, right? Works. And we don't have a lot of configuration for that, really. It's even not using Spring Boot. So with Spring Boot, it would be even less configuration. But even without Spring Boot, it's very small configuration. So now what's the idea of that one? So that looks great, right? Who likes that one? Come on. It's great. Awesome. So what is the problem with that one? First of all, it's turned on by default. So we don't have any web.xml file in that project. We haven't even referenced the web container config file anywhere. So you just need to place it in the class path, and that's it. It will be activated by default by the Servlet container. It's not a feature of Spring, it's a feature of your Servlet container. Well, that is actually a subclass of Spring, but the starting point is really the Servlet container. And as long as you use a Tomcat 7 or any more recent version, it will be turned on by default. And what's the problem with that? You can get a so-called security misconfiguration. So for example, I might create a library, and I call it the date-time library, Mike's date-time library, or whatever. And you add that to Maven, or you might add something to Maven, and the transitive dependency to that library is my library, and so on. And in my library, I have something which is called the debug web app initializer. And that class implements an interface which is the web application initializer. And that is all I need to do. So that means I can create a library. I place a class in that library which implements that interface. And now what I can do is I can add any servlet, any filter, or whatever I like to your web application. So as soon as that library is in your class path, I can do whatever I like with your web application. And if you don't look in each of these classes of the library, because you trust the library, because it's my library, then I can do really interesting stuff. So for example, here I deploy a new debug servlet, and I map it to /debug. And if I start up the application right now, you will not see any difference, first of all. So it starts up and everything is fine, hopefully. And I will redo it. The web service still works. But I could also do some more interesting stuff here. And that is debug. Oop. Yeah, of course the application name. Here we go. And now I have a very small debug servlet, and that gives me access to the root of the web application context. So, well, it doesn't look interesting, first of all, but I could do interesting thing now with that one. So I could go into the webinf directory. I could go into webinf classes. And now I see the SI order processing original. That sounds interesting, so let's look at that file. And now I see the Spring integration configuration. And that is what people might ask with my first example. Yeah, okay, you could do that code injection and so on, but you have to know the name of the channel. Well, that is a way to get the name of the channel. So try to deploy that stuff. Create a library, a useful library. Everyone will use that library, and you deploy a servlet. Nice, right? So that means this one is somehow interesting because it's very easy now with that kind of feature of the servlet spec to deploy or change your servlet configuration, and you don't even see that. Not even in your log statement, probably, as long as you haven't properly configured your log stuff. And no one is usually looking at the log statements if you start up with Tomcat, right? So anyone knows how to disable that, because it is a useful feature, of course, but if you don't want to use it, so if you don't use it yourself, you should always disable it, right? Because it also has some performance impacts. Who knows how to disable that? Anyone knows how to disable that stuff? Which one?
I think there is a notation like the fragmentation is true or false, something like that.
Not
The component scan, we can just make it sure that we are just with our package label.
No, because that is before the component scan. That happens before the component scan, before Spring.
There is a flag you can set in the web XML saying something about do not scan classes.
Autocomplete false, probably that one. So let's, or metadata complete true.
Yeah.
It is true. That is what you get if you search for it in Stack Overflow. So if you search how to disable it, Stack Overflow says metadata complete true. It is true. Well, it still works. Why? I broke it? No. It's a bug? No. It is. It is, so I can prove it. I just type something silly here. Just to show you that the XML is really working. The web XML is working. Shit, it will not break. It is working. I will show you in a second. It's one of these Tomcat features that it just ignores it if it's broken or so. Interesting one. Never seen that before. Okay, it works. So great. I know why. If you break that XML file, it will not get deployed to Tomcat because it's an Eclipse feature to not deploy broken XML files to Tomcat. Great feature, by the way. So regardless, it is working. Trust me. You have that trust zone thing, right? You can trust me. Well, not in real life, but now you can trust me. Okay, it is working. So why is metadata complete true not helping with that one? Because the servlet spec has actually two ways how to do that dynamic configuration, and most of the people don't know that. Well, if you would read the spec, then you would clearly see that there are two ways, but who usually reads the spec, right? Well, I do it, but that doesn't matter. So what is the deal with that one? So Servlet 3 has, again, two ways how to do dynamic configuration. First one is the annotated web components. And that is if you don't want to use Spring usually. Well, no one wants to do that, of course. And that is the servlet spec itself has annotations now, starting from Servlet 3, and these are called web servlet, web filter, and so on. So you can write a class, you annotate it with web servlet, web filter, whatever you like. That class will be picked up, and it will become a servlet or a filter. So that means if I create, and the nice thing with that one, these classes need to be in the classes folder. So it's not allowed to place them in a library. So if I create a library and I would annotate my class with web servlet, it will not work because it's in the lib folder. It needs to be in the classes folder in order that this stuff works. So that's pretty secure. It works pretty nice. And that can be disabled with metadata complete true. That is the only thing you can disable with metadata complete true in the web.xml file. But then we have the second one, and that is called the web fragment, and that's a nasty one. A web fragment is a separate jar file in your lib directory, and that jar file has a web fragment.xml file. And that web fragment XML file tells your container, hey, I'm a web component, a web fragment. I want to be added to your servlet configuration. And one of these web fragments is the Spring Web Application Initializer. So in order that you don't have to do that yourself, because you have to create that file, and you have to point to a file again, and you have to create that file, that points to an application class, and so on. So therefore, we simplify that for you in the Spring framework. And we created a jar file, which includes the Web Application Initializer, and that jar file has a web fragment XML in it, and therefore it's a web fragment. And as soon as you implement that Web Application Initializer interface, it will become a web fragment and it will be activated. And now the interesting thing is, how do you disable that? Well, not with metadata complete true. You do it with an element, an empty element, which is called absolute ordering. Makes sense, right? What is that absolute ordering? It's actually a web fragment absolute ordering, but in order to keep it short, they just named it absolute ordering. It was introduced in Servlet 3. And with that one, you're able to order your web fragments. So you could say Spring should come first, then Hibernate, then this, and so on. And in my opinion, they forgot to have a flag which disables the web fragments. Therefore, they say, well, if you want to disable web fragments, just create an empty absolute ordering. And that means no web fragments at all. So that means if you want to disable it, use metadata complete true, so you should always do that, and an empty absolute ordering element in your web XML. That's the only way to disable it. Trust me or not. And the idea how that works again is the Spring Web jar, which is part of the Spring framework, has that web fragment file in it. That one points to a so-called Servlet Container Initializer. That one points to the Spring Servlet Container Initializer. And that one finally points to the Web Application Initializer. Okay, can you repeat that? No? Sorry. Well, let's see how that works now. Just that you really see that you can disable it. So again, the trick is saying absolute ordering empty. And now you see that the web XML is used really. And here we go. The debug servlet is not working anymore. Well, our application is not working either. And that is kind of a problem, as you can see, because in the servlet spec, it's not really possible to limit it. So you could say, well, disable it, but then if you use it in your application, that's bad. So that means what you should probably do until now, because there is not a really good solution to that one, is that you should check what libraries are in your class path. And only libraries you trust should be in your class path, and not only because of that one. There are a lot of interesting things libraries can do in your class path, and therefore you should always check what is in your class path. For example, a lot of people set up a component scan which says, yeah, scan from base package com or so, starting at the base package com, and I could create a library which also has the package com in it, right? And then you would scan all my classes, and I can set up some Spring Beans, which will do some AOP stuff and send me an email with all the method invocations in it and all that kind of things. It's very easy to do that, by the way. So therefore, only use libraries you trust, which is always a good idea. And also, you should know about the features of your container. So not a lot of people even know about that. The Servlet spec support that kind of stuff and so on. Okay, absolute ordering and metadata complete. That's the solution, basically. By the way, there's another one, but I wouldn't trust that one. So if you want to have that feature, we get a lot of requests somehow where people say, yeah, I wanted to use that dynamic stuff, but it's not working. And then most of the time, that is because they used an older web application that tried to upgrade that one to a new Spring version. And therefore, the old web XML has the version 2.5 in it. I also need to update the schema and so on to get rid of that error here. And as soon as you have a web XML with version 2.5 and the 2.5 schema in it, that will be disabled as well. So that means if you want to use it, make sure that you have 3.0 here. Okay? Or have no web XML at all. You don't need it if you want to do anything dynamic. Any questions?
Is there a way to use the web application initializer without exposing yourself to that risk?
Yeah, the question is, can you use a web application initializer without getting that problem? No. At least not easily. Because the thing is that it will start up that Spring web fragment, and that will search for these web application initializer interfaces. And If they are on the class path, that's it. So the only solution is check your class path.
I see that you could implement a simple EOP, which would, if you don't have on your class a particular annotation, I would throw you a runtime exception. I hope that it deploys something.
Yeah, of course you can write an AAP aspect, or yeah, or with aspect J you could check your class path, for example, if
I'm just checking that particular class guide from whatever that configuration.
ah, okay, yeah,
Throw an exception every time when you have something which I don't know about.
yeah, yeah.
About it, I would
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to though that's just one way to break it. Right? So
I'm sure you could just write a filter that doesn't allow URL
yeah. So
your servers to map to.
So I just want to say there's a built-in feature which you could say only use that package, because the problem is the package scanning is not done inside of Spring. That is the problem. So the Tomcat or the web container might support that you can configure that, but you cannot configure it with a standard or inside of Spring, because it is before Spring will do that stuff. Not Spring is searching for the interface. The container is searching for it. That is the problem. So it is before the component scan of Spring starts. And that is all done by the container. So that means depending on the concrete container you use, there might be a way to do that stuff or to control it somehow. But Spring cannot do anything about it. Because Spring just tells the container, search for that interface, search for classes implementing that interface, and the container will do it. And that's it. That's the only thing we can do. We cannot do anything else. Okay, so you can play with that example. It's on GitHub, so you can download it and play with it, whatever, and try out whatever you like. Oh, that was the wrong one. Here we are. Come on. So we did that already. Okay. And that is somehow a security misconfiguration what we did now, because we didn't check the security, but it's also a so-called hidden framework feature. Well, it's obviously not hidden. You can look at the specification, it clearly says, it talks about that feature. And hidden means is you don't know it. Well, you know it, of course. Well, some developers don't know it. And therefore, they don't know how to disable it, or even don't know that they should disable it. Yeah? But there are a lot of more of these so-called hidden framework features. And during that conference, a lot of people probably told you about these interesting features, because they are actually features, they're not bugs. But some of these features can become pretty big problems in your application security. And now it becomes interesting. Well, it was interesting, hopefully, all the time, but now it becomes really interesting. Okay. So I will remove that because my application is not working, so I have to re-enable it again. And I'll go to my REST controller. And as you see, it's a standard Spring MVC REST controller. So we have a method getOrder, and we map it to order ID, and we specify that order, the return, should become our response body. So that means what happens here, the HTTP message converters of Spring MVC will kick in, and they will convert the order into what? And what is it converted?
Whatever the client put in their accept encoding.
Right. That is one of the features of Spring. It will be converted into whatever. XML, JSON, yeah. So in our example, what we see here is, oh, I have to start it, obviously. It will get converted into XML. Why? Because the client requested it. I will come to that back later. And how does it work? So we just return an order. We don't return any XML, as you can see. It's just a Java object. But if you look at that order class, then you will see that this order class has these JAXB annotations on it. So you can create them yourself, or you can use the JAXB compiler in order to create it. But at the end, you have a class which is annotated as that one should be transformed into an order element, and that property should be transformed into a name element, and that property should become an XML attribute with the name customer. So that is the information we need to provide. And then Spring MVC will convert that using JAX-B. And then you end up having that kind of stuff. So we have the order element, the customer attribute, the name, child element. Everything fine. So now we change something here and we create a new field. It's even a private field. And it is secret. And we name it secret. Never name a field which is secret, by the way. And we generate getters and setters for it. And by the way, we even don't have to do that. It's just for my convenience. So the same would work without a getter and setter as well. I can prove that also if you wanted to see it. And the idea is now that's kind of a transient field. So we wanted to use that internally, but we don't want to expose it to our web service. For example, if you have a user object, then you might want to give the user the information about the user properties, but you don't probably want to give him some internal information. So therefore, I think it's a pretty obvious, pretty useful pattern that you have more properties in your domain objects than you really want to export. So you should never export everything or expose everything. So if I do that, I don't put any XML element annotation, so I don't use any JAX-B annotation here at all. But the default of JAX-B is that it will be exposed. So even if I don't put any annotation, it's the same as with JPA. You probably know that in JPA that every property gets persisted. It's the same as JAX-B. Every property, even if you don't place an annotation on it, will be exposed. I first of all have to write something in it, of course. So I change my code now, and I say set secret. Here we go. And here we have our secret. Hidden framework feature, maybe? Of course you know it. So therefore, what should we do in order to solve that? Well, obviously, we could create a DTO, which is just for our REST web services. So we have kind of a value object or DTO, and we have our domain object. In our web service, we only use the DTO. In our backend, we only use the domain object. And then we have a DTO, of course, for Hibernate as well, because, we might want to have these annotations separate from our domain object. And then we copy from the Hibernate DTO to the domain object, from the domain object to the REST DTO, and from the domain object to the REST web services DTO maybe, and finally to some WebSocket stuff. Yeah, great idea. Well, it solves the problem, but it's not very maintainable at the end. So we can solve it on a much easier way, and that is that we go to that class again. And there is just one thing we need to place here, and that is XML transient. And by the way, don't use the transient keyword. So don't use that one, the Java one. It is not working in JAX-B. It is working in JPA. It is not working in JAX-B. Makes sense, right? So the only one which is working in JAX-B is XML transient. And as soon as I do that, I will hopefully not see that stuff again. Here we go. It's hidden. Okay, everything good now? Not? Now here comes the interesting part. So everything I do now happens on the client. I will not touch the server. Everyone can do that. I just have some interesting plugins here. One is called the live HTTP headers. The other one is called, and you can get these plugins, the modify headers. So HTTP modify headers plugin. Okay, here we go. So I do the same again. I go to my live HTTP headers plugin, and I now see the HTTP request. It's just one way to do it. There are a lot of ways how you can do that. That's very convenient. And I see that the browser says, I want to have it. No, that was the wrong one. Here we go. I want to have it as text HTML. That's the preferred one of a browser, because he always wants to have HTML. If there is no HTML, I want to have it as XHTML. If there is no XHTML, I want to have it as XML. So, and that is why we get back XML, because the browser tells our server, I want to have it as XML. But what if now the browser says I want to have it as JSON? Guess what? So, and now I use that different plugin. I say I want to modify my, and there's even code complete in that plugin, really great plugin. I want to change my accept header, and it should be application JSON. So that means it will replace the accept header of the browser and replace it that it should request application JSON. And I do the same again, and I get it as JSON. And as I only place the XML ignore annotation, I still have secret again, because I haven't placed any JSON transient or ignore annotation on it. And why is that working? Well, it's a Spring MVC feature. So as soon as you have Jackson or your class path for WebSockets or whatever you use it, Spring MVC will do that conversion for you. If someone asks, hey, I want to have it as JSON, and even if you don't want to use it, I could try it out. Give me your URL and I try it. It also works the other way around, of course. So if you use JSON, then I could say, hey, I want to have it as XML. So therefore, that might be an interesting one. So what you need to do is now is you need to use JSON ignore, and it works. But you probably don't want to do that with any format you support, right? Because that were just two examples, XML and JSON. If you would have your own converter, like protocol buffers or whatever, we have the same problem again. It's one of these Spring MVC features that by default, if you don't specify it, it will convert it into anything which is convertible. So if the browser says, I want to have it as whatever, and it is convertible into that whatever, Spring MVC will do it for you, just for your convenience. So one way to solve it is to add all these ignore annotations. And as you can see, every framework, every protocol has its own ignore annotation. Sometimes they're called ignore, sometimes transient, sometimes they use the Java transient keyword. But and you have to know which protocol is supported in Spring, right? And a better way to probably solve that is to do that in the controller. And that is possible, I think, since Spring 3.1, because we have a new code complete is not working. I blew up STS. We have a new annotation which says produces, a new attribute in the annotation, produces application XML. Here we go. So now I say that this method should only produce application XML, and that is the way you should go. So if you only want to support XML, tell the container that you only want to use XML. You can do it without that, but then the container will support everything he can support, which is, of course, very convenient, but it can also lead to some problems, especially if you have fields which shouldn't be exposed. Again, even if you don't use JSON, I would be able to do it as soon as you have the Jackson library in your class path. And even if you haven't added yourself, it might be a transitive dependency from someone else. So that will actually solve the problem, because now if I say I want to have it as JSON, it says that we cannot do that, convert it into JSON, because we specified on the controller only XML is supported. And produces an array, so you can support more than one type.
For the fairly common case where you're supporting JSON and XML, there's also the ability to tell Jackson in the object mapper configuration to use the JAXB annotation using the annotation introspector.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. In the case where you're only using supporting JSON and XML,
Yep.
you can tell the Jackson object mapper in the annotation introspector to actually use the JAXB annotation.
Yep.
As opposed to its own.
That is true, though. So that is the real secure way to do that. Of course, if you don't want to use JSON at all, use that one. If you want to use JSON, then you can configure Jackson that it should use the JAXB annotation. That's true. You could also change the conversion service. So, for example, if you only want to use XML in your whole application, then you probably don't want to put produces all the time on your method. Therefore, the more easier way would be to change the Spring MVC conversion service and tell the Spring MVC conversion service that you don't want to use the JSON converter, so kick it out of that conversion service and only apply the XML or JAXB converter, whatever you want to use. And then you just get rid of that JSON stuff. Okay, so many ways to solve that. but you need to think about it. So even if you don't use it, again, it's a framework feature and it will be there even if you don't want to have it, if you don't disable it somehow, right? So that is why you should attend one of our classes, of course, because then you learn all about that stuff in our classes. I have to do some sales pitch here. Yep.
Are other output formats hidden as well besides?
Well, XML and JSON are the most interesting. These are the ones who work with most of the objects, especially JSON is pretty nasty because with the JAXB one, you at least have to use some JAXB annotation, though JAXB is only working if you have at least that XML root element annotation. Otherwise, it will not work. JSON is a different thing because JSON works with any Java object as long as you have a default constructor. That is that problem. Sorry? It will not need the default constructor anymore. Great stuff. Okay, here we go. So, do I have a slide for that? Yeah. That is somehow security misconfiguration. So you clearly did something wrong, and that affected your application security. It is not the fault of Spring, of course. Never. You did something wrong. Yeah, you didn't know about the feature, you didn't disable it. Well, your fault. But then if you do that, then we are pretty secure, at least from that top 10 stuff. All the other stuff, we don't have time to show that. But there's also one pretty interesting security misconfiguration thing I might want to show you here. Let me just repair that a little bit. Oh, we can directly go on. So we'll remove that get secret for now, just to make it simple again. Okay. So as you can see, we not only have a get here, we also have an update method here. It's mapped. Sorry. Come on. Here we go. So we have an update method. It's mapped to order ID and put. It's clearly a REST update method, so we wanted to update an object, and we want to update the order here. Okay, so what we could do is, of course, what we do here, I'm not sure if you know that, because we don't trust these converters anymore because they're nasty and they try to convert whatever they want, and therefore, after that experience, we don't trust any Spring MVC converters anymore. So what do? We get the byte array, raw code. We have control over everything. Yeah, don't trust these frameworks. Shit. So, well, of course, just to tell you that, of course, it will be a lot easier if you would trust the framework. You could do basically the same using the Spring MVC converters and then just replace that byte array with the order object again and remove all that stuff here. So, oops. So that would have been the implementation. Oops, I removed too much. That would be the implementation for trust the converters. You just say, hey, request body converted into order, and then you send an XML JSON or whatever, it will be converted into order. Everything works. But again, we don't want to trust it, so remove that nasty one. We want to have the raw byte array. And we do everything ourselves, because then we are in charge of it. So we create a standard XML parser, it should be namespace aware. I don't do really interesting stuff here. I create a factory, and I parse it finally. And I get back an XML document, I send it to my JAXB marshaller and say, hey, marshal that one. There's no JSON in it, it's just XML, no way to create JSON or submit JSON, that it will not work. So, and now what I do is, I submit an XML document. And I have one prepared for you, it's a test XML. It's a standard XML document, right? The namespace in it, customer, order 1. So what should happen? I will update the order from ABC to order 1. The ABC was the default one, order 1 is the new one. And I will do that on the command line, of course, what else? So I have a call statement prepared here. That call statement just says, hey, read that test XML file, do a put, do it to that Spring Security Patterns REST, order ABC. I have a header that this one is the content type text XML, just to let the server know that it is XML, and fire it up. So I cannot do that with the browser because, yeah, I would have to set up something in it. Of course, there are easier ways to do that, but it also works with that command line thing here. And what has happened now on the server? Well, nothing. Oh, I have to stop, of course, the modify header stuff. Here we go. And now it was updated to order 1. That is what we wanted to have, right? Okay. Now I change my XML file. And again, so actually that XML file is in my project, but it needn't to be in my project. That's the important one. You only have to do that on the client. I only have one machine, so therefore I cannot show you that. And I change the XML file to that one. Now it becomes interesting. Ever have seen these kind of things? Though that is called DTD. It was ages ago. It was before that XML schema stuff. You still can do a lot of interesting things with a DTD. What can you do with it? You can declare a new entity with it. And my entity name is fun because it makes fun to do that. And I say the entity fun, use the file secret.txt to expand that entity fun. So the content of the entity fun should come from the file secret.txt. And guess what? That is not a file on my machine, it is on the server. So that means with that one, I can access any file on your server. Any, etc, password, shadow, whatever. Everything the server has access to, the Tomcat has access to, I can read it with that one. Well, doesn't sound interesting right now because, yeah, so I place it here and then the fun will be expanded to the content of the secret file. You don't trust me? Well, I can show you. That is the content of the secret file on my server. You should never see the content of that file. And now I just copy all that stuff over to my test file. Submit it. It works. Okay, until now, I haven't seen anything. So of course, it will be expanded on the server to the content of that file. But I don't see any information right now because a put will just return no content by default, though, yeah. But after a put, I could do a get, of course. Here we go. You should never see the content of that file. Though with that one, I'm basically able to access any file from the hard disk of the server. etc password, etc shadow, again, whatever I like. The only thing I need to have for that is I need to have a web service where I can update stuff and get it later on. Well, usually most of the web applications have that, and that is your personal information or your account information, right? So it doesn't matter what type of web service it is. I can usually update my personal information, so my password, for example, and I can use that put method or a post in order to do that kind of stuff here. And then I do a get, obviously, because of course everyone is able to get his personal information back, and then I can see any file, right? And the problem really is that on the server, you don't really see that. So if you look at that controller, and even if we have all under control, it still is working. And it's not a Spring feature. It's a feature of the XML parser, because we instruct the parser to do that. And as you know, XML is pretty old, so therefore XML was invented long before these web services stuff was invented. So therefore the people didn't even think about these kind of problems. But still the parsers support it. So what we need to do is here, we need to use that document builder factory and say that expand entity references to false. And that is a very important one. There is no reason why you should expand entities in a web service. Regardless if it is a REST or a Spring MVC web service or a Spring Web Services web service, every web service has that problem. If you don't specify that property that it should not expand entities. So as soon as I do that, and it's by default on for convenience. Again, it's not a Spring Framework feature. It's from the XML parser, and all the XML parsers have that on by default. So just to prove you that it works now, here we go. So we don't get any error message. It will just not be expanded and silently discarded. That's it. That is what we wanted to have. Okay, here comes the interesting point.
Question: if you would have a ldap-gs standard,
Yeah.
what we would have?
So the second one I showed you before, where we just have the order as an argument, and Spring will do everything for you. Well, I tell you, man, you really should check your libraries, and you should make sure that you have 3.2.4 in it. Not 3.2.3 or anything below it. 3.2.4 is the way to go. Okay? Do that now. Earlier versions are somehow affected by that. So if you just place in the argument, you will not be affected by that. So you really have to do something more. If you just would use it as an argument, it will not be affected. But there are ways to get at where you use tradeoffs internal stuff of Spring, and then you might end up with exactly that problem. And that is one of the very early CVEs, which was discovered 1 or 2 weeks ago, and it is fixed now in 3.2.4. And therefore upgrade to that version.
If your marshallers have schemas attached,
Yep.
that protects you against that stuff.
No, because the DTD is still evaluated. And usually, so it depends on, because the marshaller usually instruct the marshaller that it should validate it with the schema on your hard disk. But before that happens, the DTD will be expanded. It's something which happens before.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. It's one of these early stuff from XML, never got rid of it. Yeah?
Yeah, these entity expansion attacks can also be used to kind of crash your server because they go around the post limitations that you sometimes put on your
Exactly. Though, so that was the newest one. That's why I showed that one. There's one already around since years, and that is the XML bombing. That's pretty nice. It's recursive entity declaration, basically, and that will lead to a very big XML document, and that will crash your server. So at least it will only crash your server, whereas this one, you get all the information from the server. So that is really something. Disable all that old stuff. You probably never need it, and especially the expand entity stuff, you will never need it in a web service. There's no reason to use that in a web service, right? Definitely not. So therefore, think about that one, disable it, or use JSON and get rid of all that XML stuff. And again, upgrade.
So
Yeah. Can you repeat that, Paul? I can hardly understand you here. It's
You have HTML entity references and LT. He's saying you'll lose those as well.
No, with that one you should only use the one which point to a file. Because it is that entity references, so where we reference a file. So the default ones, they should work. Only the ones who because you don't disable the whole entity expansion stuff, only the referenced ones, so where you reference a file. So the other ones should work. And in 3.2.4, that is disabled by default in the ldap-gs marshaller. It is not disabled in XML processing. So that means if you use the XML processing yourself, like I did, then you are in charge of that, of course. If you use ldap-gs, we have disabled it by default. You can enable it if you use that for some stuff or need to use it. It's not hard-coded. It's a new property which was introduced. So that means you can re-enable it if you want to do it. If you do all the XML yourself, you are in charge of that.
So you fix it in the Spring Web. How about the Spring integration and so on? They also read it. You get XML
Yeah.
files from lots of places.
It is fixed in the object XML marshaller, which is part of Spring Core. So it's not fixed in Spring Web. So I pointed to that Spring Web. That's wrong, sorry. It's fixed in Spring Core, because that is where the XML marshaller is. I'm not sure if it's Spring Core. It's Spring OXM. Sorry, that one. And that is used in Spring Integration, Spring Batch, and everywhere. So it's basically we turned that flag in our JAX-B modular, though, that it should not expand it anymore by default. So therefore, it should be fixed everywhere as soon as you upgrade to 3.2.4. Okay, do that. And by the way, how do you get that information besides attending my session? Go pivotal.com security, I think that's a new URL now. That's a Pivotal security team, and check out that web page. And here we have XML external entity. That is exactly what I showed you right now. So check out that web page, because on that web page you will see all these stuff, and that will tell you that you should use finally. Where were we? 3.2.4, yeah. Or if you're using Spring 4 already, then you have to use the release candidate 1 or later. It's not available, but yeah. So check out that web page, right? And have a process which makes sure that, because that is a problem. You deploy an application, then it's gone, right? You never think about it anymore. And that is really the problem, because that affects any application, or a lot of applications maybe. And therefore, you should have some kind of process in place where you document what libraries are used in what application. And even if they're only in maintenance mode or don't develop any more stuff on it, you should always check if you need to upgrade a Spring Framework version, because they might be vulnerable to some interesting stuff. Okay. Security misconfiguration. So we are done now? Yeah, we are, more or less, because we are short on time. But just one, I have no time to demonstrate it anymore, but one more problem, and that is the encoding problem. That affects also a lot of ports, not only that one. And that was a nice one, which was fixed already some years ago in Tomcat, and it affected not only Tomcat, it also affected Jetty and all these stuff. And that was the interesting one, because here we provide a URL, which looks pretty interesting. It's a Unicode URL, and it's a not valid Unicode. The C0AE, or C0AE, that is one character, and it's a very high character. Actually, there is no character with that Unicode. And in Java, it was a Java bug. That's why all the web servers are affected by that. They basically treated that as a kind of invalid character. So that means if you have a Spring Security URL filter, it will not detect that one because it's just whatever. Doesn't mean anything. But on the file system, that will be replaced with .. Because they're in the Unicode specification, that if it is an invalid character because it's too high, then we need to map it to a valid character again. And the JVM didn't do that. So it was clearly a problem with the JVM. And therefore, inside of the JVM, that was something useless. In the file system, it was something useful. So that means that one passed the Spring Security filter, or any filter, Tomcat filters, anything, not only Spring Security. And it got evaluated finally to .. You can imagine you can do interesting stuff with that stuff. It is fixed now, so don't try that at home, of course. I should have said that before. Don't try all of that at home, right? Never try it with a real production server, because it's not really legal to do that. Of course, you can try it, but not with a real production server, as long as it's not your server. So at the end, it all comes down to something which is called defense and def. So for example, in order to fix that one, what you should do is use method authorization, not only URL filters. URL filters are nice, but they're more or less useless. So you should have them, right? Don't get me wrong. But don't trust them. That comes back to the trust zone stuff. The only thing you can trust is me and method security. And Rob. Okay. Well, so what is the conclusion now? Application security is a process. It's not a feature. So you always have to think about it. Every developer has to think about it, because it's very, very easy to make something wrong here. But it should not impact your architecture negatively. That means it is easy to make an application 100% secure. Just remove the network cable, that's it. So therefore, applying application security should always be something which shouldn't really affect your architecture, because your architecture should be around your domain and should be maintainable and all that kind of stuff. And there are ways to do that. I hope I showed you that. Especially with Spring, there are really ways to solve that problem. But you need to know them, of course, obviously. And yeah, frameworks can help you with that, but they can also create new security problems if you don't know these frameworks, right? So therefore, as soon as you start using a framework, and it's not one of these very, very small frameworks, then first of all, learn about that framework and how that framework works. Attend a class. That is really what you need to do. Understand your frameworks. And then you probably don't have all these problems, hopefully. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll go back and fix all these problems in your applications. Or tell me your URL and I'll show you the problems. So if you want to check out the source code, it's on GitHub. Download it and give me feedback. So if you see something in that source code, if you see a new way how you can break stuff, tell it me. Yeah, so my email address is mwiesner@gopivotal.com, so you can write me any feedback to it. You can make push requests, of course, to the GitHub repository, and the slides are, of course, on the conference website. So again, thanks for attending. Have a nice day, too.